Tarsus. By R. N. Decker. Chapter 1. What? Roared the king. Father! Please! Listen, said Laura. King Lionel of Musk was the 18th monarch in his line. And he wasn't happy. Not happy at all. In fact, he was livid. His only daughter, Princess Laura, was talking gibberish. No, roared Lionel. That's nonsense. You can't be a knight. You're to marry one. Not be one. Are you mad? Princess Laura hung her head and sighed. This had been going on now for far too long. She had finally gotten her nerve to bring up the matter with her father, and all she'd gotten from him was platitudes and pompous posturing. This was getting old. She thought he hadn't taken her seriously since her mother, Queen Ely, had died. For every fight or disagreement between them, bigger and bigger gulfs widened under their feet. And this was just one more foot of that gulf. Father, please, Laura repeated. Why won't you listen to what I have to say? King Lionel stopped his pacing and stared at his daughter. Listen to you? That's what I've been doing. What I've heard is crazy. Lionel couldn't quite get his head around what his daughter was saying. As far as he was concerned, it was just gibberish, nonsensical sounds spouting from her mouth. She hadn't been making much sense since his Ely had died. It seemed he was constantly making excuses for her actions, her being young and not knowing what she wanted to do with her life, besides a princess of course. She needed direction. She had been like that for some time now. First it was fashion, what dress was appropriate, what hairstyle, what jewelry, what shoes. He knew she must have 100 pairs of shoes, and yet she only wore 2. What did anyone need with 100? Such things not only reflected on her, but him as a king. Then it was her trying to help every homeless person and vagabond in the kingdom, which, thank the gods, her duties as princess interfered with. She had to be reminded the church was there for that very reason. She couldn't do it alone. Laura had a big heart, which he loved about her, but she had to realize how the world worked and how to cope with her responsibilities. But this. Lionel had always known she was fascinated by the knights, since she was a little girl, but actually wanting to become one, no. Absolutely not. Lionel continued, I forbid it. It was time she grew up, and for him to stop indulging her every whim. I forbid it. No princess can be a knight. You are to marry one, not be one. But, father, Laura cried, this is what I've always wanted. No. I forbid it. Lionel roared again. No daughter of mine, for that matter, no maiden, has ever been, or ever will be, a knight. And you'll not be the first. With that, the audience was over. Laura no closer to her dream of being one of the knights of the King's Guard. It had been the scene in the throne room not 2 hours ago, just after Princess Laura's 17th birthday. No matter what she said to her father, it hadn't mattered. No. You cannot be a knight. You must marry one. Not likely. But she just couldn't convince him to let her try for the King's Guard. Standing in the middle of her rooms, she fumed and grimaced. She wanted to start throwing things, have a good old-fashioned temper tantrum, maybe fling a piece of crockery, or the ugly handcrafted mug love-stricken Jonathan had made for her when she was 5. Laura remembered the first time she'd seen the guard practicing maneuvers in the courtyard. She'd been 7. She remembered it vividly, couldn't get it out of her head. Through all the years, she'd known her father would hit the roof if she mentioned something like this, but she couldn't help it. It was all she thought about. Her forays into fashion, or helping the homeless, or anything else she'd done, through all of it, this had always come back to haunt her. She'd gone down to the kitchens to beg another small portion of food from the head cook and all-around grump, Martha, and upon getting nothing but grief instead of food, she turned to storm back to her rooms, and a flash of light caught her attention from the gray-streaked window sitting off the pantry. She remembered clutching at the old weathered lintel staring at Sir Hook, Sir Gawain, Sir Guy, Sir Dwayne, and so many others, marching in step to an unheard rhythm. Their swords flashed in the noontime sun, making sparkling fairies fly over the castle walls. Dust from their feet ballooned up behind them like a dust devil, covering their feet and shins with a light coating of brown. Sweat beaded along her brows as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It fascinated her. What were they doing out there? Why did they have all their armor on? Wasn't that supposed to be for show? From that day on, she knew only one thing: she had to be a guard in the king's knights, the most respected, renowned, and loved knights of all the 5 realms. She had to. That was, until her father squashed her dreams. But Laura wasn't so easily dissuaded. If she couldn't do it with his permission, she'd do it without his permission. Laura figured what her father didn't know wouldn't hurt him. All of her life, she'd been pampered and spoiled, doing anything she wanted, going where she wanted, and getting anything she wanted. Anything, of course, within reason, or what the Queen Mother thought was in reason. She'd everything a girl, being a princess, could possibly want: money, clothes, and fineries of every shape, color, and description. She went to all the right balls to meet all the right nobles, to have all the right connections, to make the perfect marriage. She even had her own carriage with foot soldiers to do her every bidding, but with all that, still Laura was unhappy. With all she had, she didn't have what she really wanted: a direction in life. But she did now. Laura wanted to be a knight, not just any knight, but a knight of the King's Guard, the elite of all knights of the kingdom. That was her dream. The king, however, had other plans, wanting Laura to marry a knight, love having nothing to do with it. Yeah, right. She'd been forbidden. Forbidden. To follow what in her heart she knew to be true. She'd show him exactly what she thought of his plans. She'd show him she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was disappointed and miffed, her father not listening, or even considering what she wanted. Weren't kings supposed to be understanding? Weren't they supposed to help their people if they could? Encourage them? Support what they wanted? Weren't fathers supposed to encourage their children to do better things in their lives, to make something of themselves? Turning toward the doors to her rooms, she could barely make out the peak of a shadow of the guards outside. She didn't have handmaidens like other princesses, she had footmen and guards. She'd often wondered if there had been a rule somewhere about royalty saying she should have maidens in her rooms instead of footmen. Thinking of that just made things worse. She stamped her foot, fists clenched tightly by her sides, getting no satisfaction out of it. If there was a rule somewhere, couldn't there be a rule, or maybe an unknown, unused law to force her father to at least rethink his stand? Wait. He was the law. He was the king. He could make any law he wanted. She shook her head almost immediately after thinking such a thing. No, he was too stubborn, or pig-headed. He wouldn't listen. Laura flung herself on her 4-poster bed, burying her head in the pillows, sobbing. How on earth was she going to convince her father she was a grown woman who could make her own decisions? Well, close, she could make her own decisions about what to wear to a court hearing, or a court function. She just couldn't make the decision about becoming a king's knight. She knew what was best. Mother taught her to be independent. Oh mother! Oh gods, mother, the thought bringing Laura to even greater tears. Seeing her mother die in front of her eyes wasn't easy. Queen Ely had been sick for months, no one knowing why. Every healer in the 5 realms was called to help, but it was no use. In the end, at the end, it was horrible to watch. Queen Ely slowly deteriorated, wasting away, withered skin, stretched to the breaking point over her cheeks and neck, red blotches showing on her hands, feet, and under the arms, which reeked so bad she couldn't stand it herself. She had to stay in bed for weeks at a time because she couldn't stand up for more than a few moments, the strain from trying causing her searing pain running down her thin, spindly legs. Blessedly though, when the end came, it was over in moments. Ely breathed in one final breath, and then it was over. That was the day Laura realized she was truly on her own. Father had nannies do everything he should have done himself. Laura realized she didn't need anyone for anything. Her mother taught her everything in her 10 short years of life she needed to know. For one, she wouldn't ever need healers. At one time Laura thought healers knew how to do anything, cure any disease, what to say to make people feel and look better, anything, but after Mother died, she'd been but a child to think such thoughts. She wouldn't make such a mistake again. Father, by the gods, never understood. Her father never understood Mother. Her father never understood why Laura and her mother would take long walks in the garden, when the queen could do such things, or why at the end Laura had taken it upon herself to feed the queen instead of letting a nursemaid do it. Father never understood anything, didn't understand now. That's why father couldn't understand why she needed this, why deep in her heart she had to be a king's knight. Mother had been, but Mother wasn't here to tell her she could do anything she wanted. She had to make that decision on her own. Laura sat up, wiping tears from her cheeks, nodded to herself, coming to a decision: she'd do it on her own. She'd be a king's knight whether her father wanted her to or not. As the palace guards were changing nightly shifts, Princess Laura snuck out of the castle. It was a pretty simple thing for her to do. All of her life, she'd been playing in the giant halls and rooms of the castle, roaming through every nook and cranny and knew all of the guards' routines. Sidestep behind Sir Frederick's armor, a guard passes by without seeing her, step through the door to the library, around this corner, take 2 long breaths, watch a guard walk so near she could hear his breathing, go down the hall of tapestries, pull this handle to open a secret staircase, pass through to the castle gate unnoticed, watch guard change places with his replacement for the night, pass through the portcullis unseen while their backs are turned. There, she did it, she was outside. Simple. It took Laura 3 years to find all the nooks and crannies to hide in, and a lot of failures trying, but she was persistent. Until that night, however, it had only been a game. Now she used what she knew to get out of the castle for a purpose. Squatting just outside the stables, in the corrals, Pip, the stable boy, watched as Princess Laura slipped out of the castle. He was impressed by the way she'd done it. He'd tried for the better part of a year to figure out a way to do the same thing. Mulch, his guardian, had told him no one had been able to slip in or out of the palace grounds in more than a decade, due of course to the training of the guards. They were always on the highest of alerts and always ready for any kind of trouble. I guess he doesn't know everything after all. He'd have heart palpitations if he knew that strip of a girl had bested his beloved guards. Pip hated his life. Well, not exactly hated it, but it certainly wasn't the one he'd chosen for himself. He was grateful to Mulch for finding him and getting him off the streets, but the work Mulch had him do to earn his way in the castle wasn't easy. Mulch, being the head stableman for the kingdom, had taught Pip everything he knew about running a stable and taking care of animals, most of which consisted of shoveling shit, feeding, watering, and rubbing down horses used by the knights. If it hadn't been for Mulch taking pity on a lost orphan wandering the streets, he'd probably have turned out to be a thief and scrounger his whole life. So, for most of his short stay in the stables, he'd done a lot of wandering at night, trying to find the best way out, this of course being only one of them. Not to run away exactly, but find something better. The grass is always greener, as they say, but on this night, he'd seen something move in the shadow of the wall, long before he could begin his own journey. Pip realized at once who the shadow belonged to: Princess Laura. He knew who she was from the many posters around the town square announcing her 17th birthday just the week before. It was very unusual for anyone to see her outside the palace, and it was definitely unusual for anyone to see her like this. Princess Laura was supposed to be one of the most important people in the kingdom, and although he admired her for something he'd failed to do, he really didn't think she should be out without an escort of some kind. He thought about going and asking her, but no, that would look strange, a mere stable boy asking questions of the princess. He'd probably end up in a dungeon for his trouble. No, the more he thought about the princess outside the walls, the more he thought he knew what she was trying to do, the exact thing he'd been doing, trying to find a better life. Pip nodded to himself. Good luck, princess. I hope you have better luck than I do. Laura looked about her, trying to get her bearings. To the left and right the castle walls, running north to south. She looked above her and saw only faint glimpses of stars, wispy clouds blocking the rest from full view. I hope it doesn't rain. That wouldn't do a thing for my disposition. From memory and a lifetime of being inside the city and the castle, she remembered the walls continuing slightly east of west, completing an oval, rather than a complete circle. the whole structure spanning nearly 7 leagues around a central town which housed the castle in the center. The walls were 4 feet thick, made of native rock and sandstone, rising 30 feet above her head, taking nearly 50 years' hard labor from the kingdom's best masons to complete. It was intimidating at first sight, which was the point. It didn't have a moat, which now she was grateful for, but it did have a stream running from the eastern ramparts through most of the town which supplied everyone with year-round water. The only problem with it was during spring thaw, mountain snowmelt usually causing flooding in the western part of Musk. Most inhabitants of the region could only put up with it, chalking it up to a trade-off of being safe inside the walls. Levees didn't stop the flooding, and dams were out of the question. A holding pond could have been built, but then where would excess runoff go when the next thaw came? Although she'd been on the outside of the castle many times in her 17 years, she'd never been out without her footmen or castle guards. She'd been told over and over it was dangerous to be out at night without protection. Thieves and cut purses abounded when the sun went down, one of many reasons for the king's knights, and one of many why she wanted to be one. The princess took a second to orient herself to her surroundings, then began tentatively to move towards the trees just 30 yards from the castle walls. She crossed the main road, running east from the giant portcullis. When she reached the trees, she took one last look back, took a deep breath, then went in among the trees. In almost a childish way, she figured she could find someone to teach her to be a knight. She didn't know who, or where, but there had to be someone who could teach her what she needed to know. Maybe she could get to one of the other 4 kingdoms and find a teacher. One that would be willing to teach a girl. She knew from past experiences traveling, as a princess of Musk, which didn't happen as often as she wished, the nearest kingdom was Pate. And they always greeted her entourage with great fanfare, a great show of horsemanship, and a sparring from their own knights. She took with her on this excursion only the basic necessities, a bedroll, some extra clothes, a cloak in case it got cold, and some food. She was scared, which she attributed to nerves, heart-sick from her father's uncompromising morals, and determination to make her dreams a reality. She felt sure her mother would have understood. Her mother also would have understood what foolishness she was doing. Within days of escaping, she was hopelessly lost. She hadn't really thought of where she'd go, or in which direction, she simply wanted someone to help her. After 2 days Laura found outside the city walls nothing but misery. Exhausted, frightened, hungry, and totally alone, she'd made a very big mistake. A mistake she hoped she'd live through. The first night wasn't too bad, not having too long to wait until sunrise when she'd left the castle. To prevent anyone from catching her right from the start, she didn't stop, walking until she couldn't walk any longer. Her feet hurt, but she thought she was far enough away when the sun came up to stop for a short break. After walking in the woods for several hours, she realized the forest was completely different than looking at it from the castle walls. Within moments of being on the outside she also realized there was more to them than just trees. Strange sounds came through the blowing trees she didn't recognize, howls of strange beasts, buzzing, twittering, chirping, and humming. It was strange and frightening. The provisions Laura brought didn't last nearly as long as she'd expected. Within the second day, her food ran out. Wandering in the woods was a tiring and hungry job. She found she'd nibbled all of her food away long before she planned. She thought she'd at least a week's worth. She didn't eat as much as a full-grown man, she'd always eaten like a bird, tiny bites of not much food. But she didn't take into account with any kind of strenuous activity comes a greater hunger. And how could she? Never being in this kind of situation before? She knew then she'd been an idiot. But it was also too late to go back. She looked around to find only trees and bushes, when looking up, leaves on the branches blotting out the sky. A tear leaked from her eye. I was so stupid. But there was nothing for it now, she had to keep going, for good or ill. She didn't know where she was, she didn't know how to get back, she'd gone too far. How would she explain this kind of stupidity to her father? All she could do was hitch up her britches and take another step forward and pray she didn't die. The second night was the worst. Laura didn't really know how to find safe shelter from the night or the animals that roamed in it, and by sheer luck, stumbled, literally, nearly cracking her head on a stone, found the hollow of a giant oak tree, burrowing in like a golfer in its hole. The skimpy blanket she'd brought along for warmth had done nothing to frighten away the cold of the night. When morning finally came, she found herself cold, hungry, and ready to admit she'd been an idiot. Wandering in circles for over an hour after coming out of her oak burrow the next morning, a faint burbling sound came to her through a small stand of willows. It sounded as if a pot were bubbling on an open stove. She slowly approached what she hoped wouldn't turn out to be a wild animal in a fit of rage, or a witch stirring a cauldron over an open flame. Her insides were churning and her knees were knocking, something she didn't think could really happen, and found a most unexpected sight. Just past the willows, the trees seemed to stop spreading in all directions, making a forest. A clearing appeared. A clearing with a stream running down the middle of it. Laura looked upon the open space with wonder and joy. She was finally out of the never-ending gloom of the forest. It wasn't particularly large, this space, but to her it looked immense, wonderful. She could clearly see to the other side where trees began to take control again, about 60 or so yards, and when she looked to the right she could see the end about 100 yards away. To the left, the woods didn't begin for some ways. It couldn't have been more than a couple 100 yards, but to her it looked like a mile. She was at the topmost part of the clearing. She didn't care if it were to the north or south, the only thing she cared about was the stream. It flowed with a steady run of water heading to the left, gurgling and splashing over rocks and pebbles, and it was close, not even 20 paces from where she stood. With a sigh of relief she understood what she'd heard. In a matter of seconds it was as if a new world were spread out before her, no longer cooped up in a never-ending sea of branches, twigs, and a canopy of leaves blocking out the sun. She took a deep breath and smiled, the first in 2 days. If nothing else, she could take a bath and clean up, make herself feel clean again. Looking upon the glade, she nearly forgot about being exhausted, or frightened, troubles of being without food, worn to a frazzle, jumping at every sound, bedraggled and badly needing a comb through her messy locks, faded out of her mind. Lush green grass sprouted up almost immediately from the overhang of trees, sunshine beating down on her like a welcoming beacon. She wanted to run and jump into the water and splash around like a little kid in a wading pond. And the smells, oh gods, the smells were fabulous. In the forest all she could smell was dampness and moss and the cloying odor of decay, but here there was fresh air, lilac, a hint of rose, and the clean fresh smell of water. Taking a gulp of clean air, she took a step toward her goal, but, before she'd taken more than 2 from underneath the canopy of trees, something stopped her. There was something about the place that made her itch all over. Her smile slid off her face. Looking around wearily she got the oddest feeling. The clearing wasn't quite right. Nothing dangerous, at least she couldn't see anything dangerous, but something was missing, or something wasn't there that should be, or shouldn't be. She couldn't put her finger on it. It was like looking out of the corner of your eye and only seeing a shadow, fleeting, fast. It was there, but wasn't. If you looked at it straight on, it was gone altogether. Crossing her arms and rubbing herself as if she had a chill, although the sun shone down brightly overhead, Laura slowly crept to the stream, holding herself tighter the closer she got to the water. What is wrong with me? She only had a few steps to take and she'd be there, right there, nothing to worry about. She was being a goose. She took a deep breath, uncrossed her arms, kneeling down to get a drink, but fidgety as a mouse being watched by a cat nonetheless. She lifted her head to look around again before her hand could cup a mouthful of clear water to her lips. She froze. Jerking her head to the right, then the left, she saw something again, not there, but was. A flash of color? A flash of reflected light from the stream? She didn't know. Couldn't tell. Trying to shake the feeling, or whatever it was off, she shrugged and bent to get that drink. But her head came up for the second time. She was sure she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A sparkle? But, looking around her, saw nothing. Nothing but the breeze blowing the grass, only the breeze. Had there been a breeze before? She couldn't remember. Laura shook her head slightly to clear her vision. She couldn't have seen anything. There was nothing out there. But there was. Color, flash, shadow. Laura was tired and hungry, needing a bath. She shook her head again, convincing herself she was only imaging things. Smiling, she got slowly to her feet, forgetting her drink. She walked down the stream a ways, thinking to find a suitable spot to bathe, then with a chuckle remembering she hadn't any soap. Oh well, maybe next time I do something this foolish, I'll remember to bring all my toiletries. Including soap. Next time. What was I thinking? There wasn't going to be a next time. She was beginning to realize how stupid she'd actually been. She wouldn't admit it to anyone else, but she finally came to the conclusion that she was a little hasty in her thinking and her actions. There could have been a better way to get her father to agree with her wishes. She'd been an idiot in the grandest way. She laughed out loud thinking of it. Then she saw something monstrous and wonderful. Actually, she nearly ran right into it. 10 feet in front of her was a dragon. The biggest she'd ever seen. Well, the only dragon she'd ever seen. Oh no, she whispered, now frozen with fear. Where did that come from? Laura decided this must have been what was wrong with the glade. This was what made her so uncomfortable when she first laid eyes on the clearing. That, whatever it was, had been keeping her from seeing the dragon. Maybe magic? Had to be magic. She slowly backed away, the dragon apparently not noticing her. Then she stopped again. Was that even possible? She was 10 feet from it. If she wanted, she could reach out and touch it. Its eyes, a beautiful orange flecked with red, were looking right at her. Well, right through her. The more she stood and watched, she noticed its eyes hadn't blinked, or moved, or anything natural. This is crazy, she whispered, slowly taking another step. Nothing happened. It didn't stir or move its head to follow her in any way. She took another step back, slowly letting out her breath. She wasn't even aware she'd been holding it until she heard air rushing out of her mouth. Another step, never taking her eyes off the dragon. Then, another step. Another. One more. She stopped. Something's wrong. But what? It should have. I don't know. Ate me? Or something. But it hasn't even blinked its eyes. This was strange. Why hadn't the creature tried to stop her? It was as if it were asleep or not able to move or enchanted. Laura's more curious nature got the better of her. Cautiously, very cautiously, she inched her way back to the dragon, getting as close to it as she could without screaming her head off and bolting back to the tree line. She didn't know why, but backing away didn't seem quite right any longer. The dragon was a deep, rich, green color with its scales shining full of all the colors of the forest, as if its flesh reflected the colors and textures around it, like a mirror, but different somehow. The shadow, as she got nearer, was the reason she hadn't seen it when she first came into the clearing. It had misdirected her vision to look at what wasn't there, instead of what was. He was quite obviously in plain sight, always assuming it was a he, of course, and he was very big, 40 feet long if an inch. Circling the animal, looking for any kind of movement, she crept to its head and peered into one of its eyes. Nothing. She could see her reflection in them, but that's all, a blank expression staring back. Quite beautiful eyes though, unusual, gold with red flecks. Laura pondered what to do. Run from it? She was a bit nervous, actually more than a bit. Find a place to hide from it? Like where? It was a field for the God's sake, ignore the brute? Yeah, like that could happen, return home? Which would constitute running, try to help it. As she pondered all possible things she could do, she absently brushed against the dragon with one hand. Then, it spoke to her. Do you mind? Laura jumped as if someone had goosed her. She hurriedly looked about for the source of the voice. No one there. She shook her head as if clearing it of cobwebs. She touched the dragon again, this time on purpose, marveling at the feel of him, slowly letting her hand slide down its scales, smooth, but also rough in places, like sand, but not quite that either. Then she noticed movement from its body where her hand was, slowly rising up, then down, like a bellows from a forge. If she didn't know any better, she'd swear it was breathing. But that would mean, Realization hit her like a rock and she started to shake. Then froze with fear. Then she didn't know what to do. She removed her hand from the dragon hastily, slowly swiveling her head to look at the dragon's eye again. It blinked. Her breath sucked in a rush. Then, massive snout, about the size of her head, was right in front of her. She blinked, tears slowly flowing down her cheeks, then she started shaking all over. Then the voice was saying, "Do you mind?" In a moment of unnatural clarity.